Growing up in Maple Grove Estates, I never quite felt like I belonged. The massive houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and luxury cars in every driveway seemed to mock our modest living situation. I'm Emma Mitchell, and my story begins with a barbecue that changed everything. My parents, Thomas and Linda Mitchell, moved into 156 Maple Drive when I was just 5 years old. Back then, the neighborhood was different, warmer, more welcoming. But as property values skyrocketed and wealthy families moved in, the spirit of community slowly eroded into something cold and exclusive. Our house stood out like a sore thumb. While others renovated and expanded, we maintained our simple two-story home the best we could. Dad worked as a high school teacher, and Mom ran a small flower shop downtown. We weren't poor, but compared to our neighbors, we might as well have been living in poverty. Sarah Henderson, who lived in the mansion next door, never missed an opportunity to remind us of our place in the social hierarchy. Her husband James, CEO of a tech company, would smirk from behind his imported cigars whenever we crossed paths. They represented everything wrong with what Maple Grove had become: wealth without warmth, success without soul. The annual neighborhood barbecue had always been a tradition, dating back decades. This year, it was the Hendersons' turn to host. Mom didn't want to go, but Dad insisted we maintain appearances. "We have as much right to be here as anyone else," he'd said, straightening his collar in the mirror. If only he knew how right he was. That afternoon, I helped Mom prepare her famous potato salad. "Maybe this year will be different," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, not believing it either. As we walked next door, carrying our contribution to the potluck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The Hendersons' backyard was packed with the neighborhood alight. Women in designer sundresses clustered around the pool, while men in polo shirts discussed stock portfolios and golf handicaps. Sarah spotted us immediately, her perfectly Botox face twisting into a practiced smile. "Oh, the Mitchells," she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How nice of you to join us. Linda, dear, you can put that." She gestured vaguely at Mom's potato salad. "Over there with the other dishes." I watched Mom's face flush as she placed her carefully prepared dish among the catered spreads. Dad squeezed her hand, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. We found seats at an empty table near the edge of the party. The only empty table, I realized with a sinking feeling. As the afternoon wore on, the subtle jabs became more frequent and less subtle. Sarah's voice carried across the yard as she discussed property values with her equally wealthy friends. "It's just that some properties really bring down the neighborhood's appeal," she said, looking pointedly at our house. "Don't you agree, James?" James Henderson lowered his crystal tumbler of scotch and nodded sagely. "Absolutely, darling. We've discussed this with the Homeowners Association. Perhaps it's time to implement some new standards." My blood boiled, but years of enduring their condescension had taught me to keep my composure. I was about to suggest to my parents that we leave when I noticed an unfamiliar figure walking up the Hendersons' driveway. The man wore an impeccable suit that made even James's designer outfit look cheap. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with purpose. As he approached the gathering, conversations quieted and heads turned. "I'm looking for Emma Mitchell," he announced, his voice clear and professional. Sarah's eyebrows shot up as I stood. "That's me," I said, trying to ignore the whispers that erupted around us. The man nodded and extended his hand. "Jonathan Pierce, from Pierce and Associates Law Firm. I represent the estate of Harold Montgomery. Might we speak privately?" The name hit me like a thunderbolt. Harold Montgomery, my grandfather, whom I'd never met. He'd had a falling out with my father decades ago, long before I was born. All I knew about him came from old photographs and whispered conversations. Sarah, unable to contain herself, sashayed over. "Now surely any business can wait until after our little gathering," she said, placing herself between me and Mr. Pierce. We wouldn't want to disrupt the party. Mr. Pierce's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened slightly. "I'm afraid this matter is rather urgent, Mrs. Henderson. Or should I say, tenant?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's perfect smile faltered. "I beg your pardon. Perhaps we should all sit down," Mr. Pierce suggested, opening his briefcase. "This concerns the entire neighborhood, actually." The next few minutes felt surreal as Mr. Pierce explained that my grandfather, Harold Montgomery had been the actual owner of all of Maple Grove Estates. He purchased the land decades ago but chose to live elsewhere, allowing a management company to handle the properties. The Hendersons, like everyone else, had been renting from him all these years through a complex network of shell companies. Your grandfather passed away last month, Mr. Pierce continued, addressing me directly. In his will, he left the entire estate, including all of Maple Grove, to you, Miss Mitchell. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face had gone pale, her manicured hand clutching James' arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. Around us, our neighbors stared in shocked disbelief. That's impossible, James sputtered, finally finding his voice. We own this house. We have the deed. You have a carefully crafted lease agreement, Mr. Pierce corrected, producing a stack of documents. Your monthly property taxes have actually been rent payments. Mr. Montgomery was quite brilliant in how he structured everything. I sat there, struggling to process what I was hearing. The house I'd grown up in, the neighborhood that had made me feel so inferior, it had all belonged to my grandfather. And now, somehow, it all belonged to me. There must be some mistake, Sarah said, her voice rising. We've lived here for 15 years. We've invested hundreds of thousands in renovations, all of which were approved through the management company as per your lease agreement, Mr. Pierce replied calmly. Miss Mitchell now has full discretion over all properties in Maple Grove Estates. I looked at my parents, who appeared equally stunned. Dad's face showed a mix of emotions: shock, confusion, and something else. Pride? Regret? I couldn't quite tell. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Pierce said, standing, Miss Mitchell, and I have some paperwork to discuss. Shall we use your study, Mrs. Henderson? After all, it is Miss Mitchell's property now. As I followed Mr. Pierce into the house, I heard the party dissolving into chaos behind me. Sarah's voice rose above the others, demanding answers, making threats about lawyers and lawsuits. But for the first time in my life, her words had no power over me. Inside the Hendersons' study, Mr. Pierce laid out the full scope of my inheritance. The neighborhood was just the beginning. There were other properties, investments, and accounts I needed to know about. But my mind kept returning to one detail. Did he know? I asked suddenly. My grandfather, did he know how they treated us? Mr. Pierce's expression softened slightly. Mr. Montgomery had eyes and ears everywhere, Miss Mitchell. He watched you grow up from afar, saw how you and your parents handled adversity with grace. In his final years, he spoke often of how proud he was of the family you'd become. Tears welled up in my eyes as I thought of the grandfather I'd never known, watching over us all these years. Outside, I could hear the party completely falling apart as neighbors rushed to their phones, presumably to call their lawyers. What happens now? I asked, wiping my eyes. That, Miss Mitchell, is entirely up to you. The properties, the leases, the future of Maple Grove, it's all in your hands. I nodded, a plan already forming in my mind. The Hendersons had spent years making us feel small, but now the tables had turned. The real question was, what kind of landlord did I want to be? The next morning, I woke up to chaos. News of my inheritance had spread through Maple Grove like wildfire. My phone was flooded with messages, some congratulatory, others panicked, and many from neighbors suddenly wanting to reconnect. Sarah Henderson's number appeared repeatedly, her voicemails growing increasingly desperate. James had apparently spent the night calling every lawyer in the city, only to discover that my grandfather's legal team had ironclad documentation for everything. I sat at our kitchen table, watching Mom prepare breakfast like any other morning. But everything felt different now. Dad kept glancing at the window, where a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, presumably hoping to catch a glimpse of the neighborhood's new owner. What are you thinking, sweetheart? Mom asked, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. I took a deep breath. I'm thinking about Grandpa, why he did this, what he wanted me to learn. I paused, cutting into my pancakes, and I'm thinking about all the families like us who got pushed out of this neighborhood over the years. Dad looked up from his coffee. Your grandfather, he was a complicated man, Emma. We had our differences, but he always had a strong sense of justice. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Mr. Pierce stood there, looking fresh despite the early hour. Good morning, Miss Mitchell. I thought you might want to review the current lease terms. There are some interesting clauses we should discuss. As we went through the documents, a picture emerged that made me smile. My grandfather hadn't just been a shrewd businessman, he'd been playing a long game. The leases all contained provisions that gave the owner extraordinary control over rental terms and community standards. So, I said, looking up from a particularly interesting clause, I could essentially rewrite the entire rental agreement. With proper notice, yes, Mr. Pierce confirmed. Your grandfather ensured maximum flexibility for the property owner. I spent the next few hours drafting new terms with Mr. Pierce's help. By afternoon, we had everything ready. I called for a mandatory community meeting at the neighborhood clubhouse, another property I now owned. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Every resident of Maple Grove had shown up, their faces a mix of worry and curiosity. Sarah and James Henderson sat in the front row, trying to maintain their usual air of superiority despite their obvious distress. Thank you all for coming, I began, standing at the podium. As you've heard, I'm now your landlord. I've spent the day reviewing everyone's lease agreements and I've decided to make some changes. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah's hand shot up immediately, but I continued speaking. First, all current rents will be adjusted based on a fair market value assessment, not the inflated rates many of you have been paying. Second, I'm establishing a community board that will include representatives from all income levels. And third, I paused, making eye contact with Sarah. Any form of discrimination or harassment based on economic status will result in immediate lease termination. The room erupted. James Henderson jumped to his feet. This is outrageous. You can't just change everything overnight. We have rights. Actually, Mr. Henderson, Mr. Pierce interjected smoothly. According to your lease agreement, she can. Would you like to review the terms you signed 15 years ago? As James sputtered, I continued. I'm not interested in revenge. What I want is to restore this neighborhood to what it was meant to be, a community where people of different backgrounds can live together with respect. I pulled out another document, which brings me to the Hendersons. Sarah, James, I've reviewed the numerous complaints against you from other residents. The hostile environment you've created, the discriminatory comments, the attempts to force out families who don't meet your standards, it all violates your lease terms. Sarah's face had gone from red to white. You wouldn't dare. I'm exercising my right to terminate your lease, effective immediately. You have 30 days to vacate the property. The silence that followed was broken by a small sound. Someone was clapping. Then another person joined in, and another. Soon half the room was applauding. I saw relief on faces I recognized from years of shared subtle humiliations at the Hendersons' hands. This isn't over, James threatened, standing to leave. Our lawyers will. Your lawyers will find that everything is perfectly legal, Mr. Pierce interrupted. Miss Mitchell, should I show them the documentation your grandfather kept of their lease violations over the years? The Hendersons stormed out, but I wasn't done. One more thing, I announced to the remaining residents. I'm establishing a scholarship fund for local students in a community improvement program. The focus will be on making Maple Grove accessible to families of all income levels while maintaining a quality of life for everyone. Over the next few months, Maple Grove transformed. The Hendersons moved out, their mansion converted into a community center with after-school programs. Other wealthy residents who couldn't accept the changes followed, making room for new families who brought fresh energy to the neighborhood. We kept our modest house exactly as it was, though Mom finally got the garden she'd always wanted. Dad retired from teaching but volunteered at the community center, mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self. One evening, as I sat on our porch watching children play on lawns that had once been off-limits, I found an old photograph in my grandfather's papers. It showed him standing in front of Maple Grove decades ago, when it was just empty land. On the back, he'd written, "Build something that matters." Sarah Henderson still lives in the city. Sometimes I see her at the grocery store, driving a much more modest car these days. She always looks away quickly, but I notice she no longer carries herself with that same arrogant pride. Last week, I received a letter from a young girl who recently moved into the neighborhood with her single mother. "Thank you," she wrote, "for making a place where we don't have to feel ashamed." I keep that letter on my desk, next to my grandfather's photo. He built something that mattered, all right, not just properties and investments, but a legacy of justice. And now it was my turn to carry it forward. The wealth he left me wasn't just in real estate and bank accounts. It was in the lesson he taught me through this inheritance. True richness isn't measured by the size of your house or the car you drive. but by the community you build and the lives you touch. As I watch Maple Grove flourish, growing more diverse and vibrant with each passing day, I think about how sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in making others suffer, but in creating something beautiful from the ashes of their cruelty. And in the end, that's worth more than all the mansions in the world.